Now we'd move back up to number 7, and again, that's the zoning amendments for the year-round housing, and Donna Creef will handle this one.
Good morning.
Good morning, Donna.
I have a pretty comprehensive set of amendments, and so while I'm up here speaking today, I'm going to be looking down at my notes because I want to make sure that I get everything in the record that we need to get in the record as we talk about this. And this request goes back to June of this year when folks from the Outer Banks Chamber appeared in front of the board at public comment and asked the board to direct the planning board and the planning director to look at the Dare County zoning ordinance and the zoning regulations that apply for unincorporated Dare County and see if there were amendments that we could make that would facilitate the construction of housing units that could be used for year-round housing. And throughout the review of this by the planning board, I've been very particular that I've referred to it as year-round housing and not use the term affordable housing or workforce housing, because generally when you have zoning regulations that are affordable zoning regulations or workforce house zoning regulations, such as we do have in the zoning ordinance under section 2258.2, which is our family housing incentive standards, those zoning regulations have qualifiers that apply to income levels or have sales or rent prices that are associated with those. And the amendments that I am talking about today do not have income qualifiers, and they do not have any sort of sales or rent limitations. And so I'm just referring to them as year-round housing because the amendments are designed to try to incorporate some flexibility into our zoning standards so that the private sector can respond and hopefully construct some housing units that will be dedicated to year-round residency and year-round occupancy. The chamber request focused on 3 things, and I'm going to get into those details in just a minute. But I do want to say that there's some things that these zoning amendments won't do. And one of those is that if you have an illegal ground floor enclosure in your house that's below base flood, this is not going to make that legal. We are not going to allow you to go in, and the zoning rules can't supersede the flood rules, and so I want to make sure that I'm very clear about that, because if you have an area that's below base flood, you can't use it according to the federal flood rules, and so we can't do anything that compromises our participation into the National Flood Insurance Program. These are very comprehensive, and so I'm going to go through this in some detail, and it will take a few minutes, so it's a good thing that you had that public hearing so those folks could get that taken care of. The chamber made a request, and then the planning board has recommendations, and in some instances the planning board recommendation varies a little bit. There's 4 main components of the amendment packet. They deal with minimum lot sizes for duplex lots, multifamily dwelling density, accessory dwelling units, and a 4th component that was added as a result of the public hearing conducted by the planning board, and that's what I'm calling cluster home development. As I go through this, it might be best that we take questions for each component. However the chairman wants to handle it, I'll be glad to interrupt with questions that need to be asked and answered. The first component has to do with the lot sizes for duplex structures. A duplex structure is a structure that has 2 units in it under one roof. They share a common wall or a common floor and roof. We have 25 zoning districts in unincorporated Dare County that currently allow duplex structures. The chamber request was that we amend the minimum lot size in these districts to be consistent with the minimum lot size for single-family homes. The minimum lot size for single-family homes that are served by Central Water is 15,000 square feet. It has been this since 1982. The minimum lot size for homes that are served by private wells is 20,000 square feet. Throughout our districts that currently allow duplex structures, they vary from 25,000 square feet to 20,000 square feet. And so the amendment request from the chamber was to bring that minimum lot size to be consistent with the single-family lot size, the logic being that if you have a 6-bedroom house on a 15,000 square foot lot, the impacts from that are no different than if you have a duplex that has 2 3-bedroom units in it. The planning board agreed with that recommendation. As I said, there are 25 districts in unincorporated Dare County that currently allow duplex structures. We are not asking to amend any zoning districts to add duplexes to those districts that don't have duplex structures as their list of uses now. The districts that currently have duplex structures, they're scattered throughout unincorporated Dare County, Collington, Roanoke Island, Hatteras Island. So those amendments would go in and change all of those districts to have 15,000 square feet for central water lots and 20,000 square feet for lots that are served by private wells, because our areas on the mainland do not have central water in East Lake and Mans Harbor. I don't know if you guys have any questions about the duplex amendments. If not, I'm going to go right ahead and start talking about the multifamily dwelling densities, which is the second component of the request. As I said in my opening comments, the county has a section in the zoning ordinance, section 2258.2, which is our family housing incentive standards, and they were adopted in 2008, and they have income qualifiers, and they have incentives in there to do certain things. If you agree to these income qualifiers, and for 25 years, we put a limit on the amount of rent and sales that you can charge for those structures. And there's dwelling density increases in that section, and the chamber request was that we go into the districts that currently allow multifamily structures, and that we have those districts reflect the dwelling densities that are in our family housing incentive standards. The planning board recommendation was generally consistent with that. There was a few tweaks that the planning board made as we discussed this, and I'm going to read through these densities, what we have now and what the recommendation is for the increase in the density. In the RS6 district, currently it's 4 units per acre. The recommendation is that we go to 10 units per acre. The RS8, it's currently 6 units per acre. The recommendation is for 8 units per acre. In the R2 district, the language is specific that it allows townhouses. The planning board recommendation is that we increase that dwelling density from 4 to 6, and that the word townhouse be substituted with the word multifamily. Townhouse refers to the ownership of the unit. Typically, a townhouse is considered a multifamily structure, but when you own a townhouse, it shares a common wall, and you own the ground underneath it. With a condominium of an apartment building, you just own that unit. You don't own the ground underneath it. And so the planning board felt that this was an appropriate change to make, and so that's a little bit of an expansion there, in addition to the dwelling density increase to 6 units per acre. The same for the R2H. 4 townhomes are allowed now. The recommendation is that it go to 6 multifamily units per acre. R3 is split to where you can have 8 units per acre north of Oregon Inlet and 6 units per acre south of Oregon Inlet, and that recommendation is to just go to 10 units per acre on both sides of the inlet. C2, C3, and the I-1 district refer back to the R3 dwelling densities for multifamily structures, and so they are recommended to go to that 10 unit per acre. The C2H is currently at 4 units per acre, and that is recommended to go to 6 units per acre. The S1 district was amended in 2014 to not rely on dwelling density, but to have a floor area ratio, and that is a 0.4 floor area ratio. And when you apply that, it ends up being a higher dwelling density than the 8 that was requested by the chamber. So the planning board recommendation was that we leave the S1 district to rely on the floor area ratio and not to revert back to that dwelling density per acre. Most of these dwelling densities are the dwelling densities that were originally incorporated into the zoning ordinance in 1975. The county did amend the dwelling densities in 2003 to lower those dwelling densities, and in most instances what we're doing with these amendments is simply rolling them back to what they were to the 1975 level.
Donna.
Yes, sir.
Help me, wouldn't the floor area ratio change in those other districts other than S1 when we're going from 6 to 10 or 6 to 8? Wouldn't that change?
The S1 is the only district that specifically applies a floor area ratio and not a dwelling density to multifamily units.
Gotcha,
So
okay.
we had a specific request from a developer who had property in S1 back in 2014, and at that time we amended it. The S1 district at the time, when we amended it to the floor area ratio, had dwelling densities of 3 to 5,
Right.
which were the lowest dwelling densities of any of our multifamily districts, which is kind of ironic since the S1 is our free-for-all district,
Right.
and you can have anything. It had very restrictive multifamily dwelling densities. And so that's why we felt it was appropriate to go with that higher end of the floor area ratio and not adjust the other ones to do it on floor area ratio.
Okay.
Could I just ask a quick question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you explain floor area ratio to an
Floor-
uninitiated
Yes, and
commissioner? That would be
I
me.
apologize for not doing that. I meant to do that and I just forgot to do so. But floor area ratio is you use a percentage of floor area to the gross area of the lot. So you go in and say, if you have a 10,000 square foot lot, you can have 0.4% of that dedicated to your floor area in the building. It's kind of a complicated way to do things, and that's why we didn't carry it over to all the other dwelling densities of the multifamily. So it limits you on the amount of heated floor space that you can have compared to the size of your property. Floor area to the size of the lot.
I was tangling myself with the math. So on a theoretical 15,000 square foot lot, what would be my permissible floor area?
I don't know that right off the top of my head. Math
Yeah,
is not my suit,
10%
but
of
yes.
that 15,000 would be 1,500.
Right, so you're just shy of 7,500. is I think it's-
1% would be 150. 0.4% would be,
No, it's 40.
this says 0.4,
It's 0.4% of floor area ratio.
which would be
so-
60 feet of heated space. That's, guys, that's where I tangled myself,
yeah,
and
and
I thought
it's-
I was doing something wrong. So
No,
I'm
you're
just-
not, you're not. It's a complicated way to
It's very
do multifamily, and that's why we didn't carry it forward.
But it couldn't possibly be 0.4%.
It's not 0.4%.
That's
No,
what I've heard.
No,
it's
40%.
It's 40%.
4 times
Yes.
1,500.
So on
Yes.
15,000 square feet, it's 6,000 square
Right.
feet.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw 0.4%, and that's why I
Yeah,
was
I
getting
know.
tangled, so
So-
that makes much more sense.
Right,
my head off
so
too.
the floor area ratio affects not just the spatial layout of a building, but the bulk of the building
bulk
as
of it.
well.
So if we were to restate that current floor area ratio of 40% of gross area of parcel, that would kind of,
The way that it computes to a dwelling density per acre, it ends up being 12 to 15 units per acre, depending on the size of the tract and the amount of the wetlands that you have.
yeah,
The issue is when you put 0.4%, that's 0.4 divided by 100, and what you're talking about is actually 40%.
That's right.
Right, I'm sorry, I
It don't say
misspoke.
0.4%,
Sorry
it says
about that.
0.4.
yeah, that's where I got tangled. I got it now. Thank you.
Any other questions about the multifamily? Okay, so the next component is the accessory dwelling units, and an accessory dwelling unit is a secondary unit that you have on one piece of property. You have your principal use structure, and then you have a smaller subordinate dwelling unit that functions in conjunction with the principal use structure. And the chamber request was really twofold. We have 14 zoning districts in Wanchese, Mans Harbor, and East Lake that currently allow accessory dwelling units. And that language and that use was incorporated into those zoning maps when we adopted them over the course of the past 10, 15 years. The Mans Harbor accessory dwelling units, the language that is in those two districts simply says that the accessory dwelling unit has to be subordinate in size to the principal use dwelling. The Wanchese and the East Lake zoning districts have a size cap of 900 square feet. So the chamber request was that those districts that currently allow accessory use dwellings, that there not be any size limitation on it, and that just be simply that it be subordinate in size. They also asked that The zoning districts that currently allow duplex structures, those same ones where we're amending the minimum lot size, that we go in and add accessory use dwellings to those districts that allow duplex structures. The planning board recommendation varied the most from the chamber request on this, in that they agreed that we should go in and amend those districts that allow duplex structures to have accessory use structures. They felt that due to the amount of time and effort from the community that went into the development of the Wanchese and the Eastlake maps, that we not change that size limit in those 14 districts, that we allow them to continue to have the size limit of 900 square feet. In those new districts where we're adding this, they developed a set of regulations that you would go through if you wanted to apply for an accessory dwelling unit. And those standards have I think it's nine different elements that would be part of that review process. Those districts that the planning board is recommending that be added to have the accessory dwelling unit includes the S1 district, the R2 district, the R2A, the R2B, the R2H, the R2AH, the C2, the C2H, the C3, the S1, the RS6, the RS8, the R3, and the SNC. My staff packet inadvertently included the VC2, and that is not part of this text amendment. I realized that this morning when I was looking over my notes. So we have 14 districts that currently allow accessory dwelling units. The planning board is recommending that we add 14 other districts that we have out there now, that accessory dwelling units be able to be constructed in those districts. The review procedures would entail someone coming into the planning department and requesting a permit. It is not a board level review, it is simply a staff level review. The planning board incorporated some size limits different than the 900 square feet. Their recommendation is that the accessory dwelling unit in these 14 districts that are located outside of Wanchese and Eastlake and Mans Harbor be allowed to have accessory dwelling units up to 50% of the size of the principal use structure with a cap of 1,200 square feet. So if you were here on Roanoke Island in an R3 district and you had a 3,000 square foot house, you would be held to a 1,200 square foot accessory dwelling unit. If you were here on Roanoke Island and you had a 2,000 square foot house, you would have a 1,000 square foot accessory dwelling unit. One accessory dwelling unit, one principal use structure on a lot. That accessory dwelling unit can be attached to your house, or it can be a separate structure on your house if you can get that separate structure to meet the principal use setbacks and it meets the base flood requirements.
And the coverage rule as well, Donna?
I'm sorry?
The coverage rule as well, cannot exceed.
Yes, that's one of the qualifiers that you agree to. The planning board spent a great deal of time talking about lot coverage, and that was in fact the one issue that resulted in us tabling it after their public hearing and allowing additional staff review. And this was also at the same time that we were having that 21 inches of rain in July, and we had people in X zones and other areas that were experiencing flooding. And so the planning board felt like us just having this broad increase in lot coverage was not appropriate. So we've taken that 1,200 max and applied that to the typical 30% lot coverage and said, okay, you can go up to 38%, which is 1,200 if that's the size of your ADU. If you're that guy with the 2,000 square foot house that only has 1,000 square feet of accessory dwelling unit allowed, we're only going to allow you a 1,000 square foot increase. So the increase in the lot coverage is the exact match of the size of the ADU. Now, if you have a house and you have a room over your garage that's currently not finished off and you want to use that as an accessory dwelling unit and have a second unit with, the separate door, then we will allow you to do that. And we're not going to limit you to that 1,200 square feet because you're already under one roof and you're not impacting the lot coverage. And so for all intents and purposes, when you look at that house, you can't tell that there's another unit inside of it.
Donna, I have a quick question. Does the percentage of lot cover include all impervious surface?
It includes all impervious surfaces.
Okay.
Your paved parking, your house, your decks, and things like that. So any impervious coverage. And that, again, that 38%, it was based on the concern that we didn't want to have these tremendous increases in impervious coverages. Each ADU would have to have 2 parking spaces, a 10 by 20 parking space. Again, these parking spaces would not need to be impervious. They could be incorporated off of the right-of-way. If you have a grassed area, you just need to designate those 2 parking spaces. If you have extra impervious parking and you can accommodate those 2 parking spaces in that, then that works well as well. Then you can make that work. It has to be constructed to the state building code. You cannot use an RV or a travel trailer as an accessory dwelling unit. It has to meet the principal use setbacks. It has to be built to the building height of the applicable zoning district. And perhaps the number one issue that's always comes up in the discussion at the chamber meetings and with the planning board is, so if we're allowing these to be used for year-round occupancy, how are we guaranteeing that they're gonna be used for year-round occupancy and not be an Airbnb? And in my research and writing these regulations, I've looked at several other communities in North Carolina, and they define a short-term occupancy versus a long-term occupancy, short-term being 30 days or less. I think some of the communities out in the western part of the state, I think one of them actually did 14 days or less. So if it's considered defining short-term occupancy as 30 days or less, long-term occupancy is 31 days or more. When you come in to apply for an accessory dwelling unit, we're gonna write a statement that you're gonna sign saying, I agree that I understand that this is for year-round occupancy. I also suggest, and this was not part of the planning board recommendation, and Mr. Outen can weigh in on this, is that we have that statement recorded in the Register of Deeds so that if that property is sold, that new owner knows that that accessory dwelling unit has to function as a year-round occupancy.
And what would the penalties be if they didn't comply?
We could pull your electrical meter to the accessory dwelling unit.
Okay.
That's the big stick right there. It's very complicated to do that. Once you have power to someone, it's really complicated to undo that, and the building inspectors hate that, and the attorneys hate that. But that is the ultimate enforcement tool, is to pull your power.
Okay.
So, and again, at the very least, we would have you we'd have you sign that statement, and it would be in our files. If we record it in the Register of Deeds, it has much more weight. So that is it for the accessory use structures.
Donna, just a question.
Yes,
Just
sir.
a question on that, just in review. The areas that currently have the 900 square foot maximum are going to stay 900 square foot
That is
maximum.
the planning board recommendation.
And the new ones will have the 50% or 1,200 square foot maximum.
Right, the districts that we're expanding that to.
Gotcha,
Yes,
okay,
sir.
all right.
Donna,
And-
two questions. I'm sorry.
I just wanted one up before we got too far away from the duplexes, just to ask
Right.
one about that. It just popped in. If someone wants to take a duplex that's there now, and because of the new densities, it allows them to add on to
To the footprint of the structure?
the duplex, and add another unit, let's say, to it. That it's not a duplex, it's a triplex.
Well, it becomes multifamily then, right.
Okay, but how does that affect if they're getting too close to the lot boundary or too close to another adjacent dwelling or something like, do the same setbacks and everything apply to those?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Same
sir.
rules apply to that? Okay,
Yes, sir.
All right,
Yes, sir.
go ahead, thank you.
What does that do, what does all this do to the health department requirements? Is it going to
Well,
require
it's
additional septic for
it's
these?
implicit that we're not gonna issue you a building permit until you have your septic permit to do
So
so.
another limiting factor is the need for added drain field
Right.
That's right.
on the parcel.
That's right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. And I didn't write
Well
that into the
separation.
standards because that's implicit that we're not going to issue a building permit unless you have your septic capacity worked out.
Do repair areas come into effect as well when you,
I'm sure they do,
okay,
yes.
that's
yes.
existing public health rule?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Ordinance.
and again, as I said, these rules don't supersede the flood rules. They don't supersede the wastewater rules either.
Thank you.
Right.
And then, does it help any with enforcement if it's done as a conditional use with a permit you could revoke?
We talked about that, and in my opinion, the accessory dwelling units, and again, this is just my opinion, that if we had every person that applied for one coming in front of the Board of Commissioners, that it may get to be very cumbersome in the board review process. And so my thought is that if we simply record that document, that could take the place of having the conditional use permit. It might be 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And it may, you know, if I thought that there was gonna be 5 people that come in over the course of 6 months and did that, then sure, we could do it as a conditional use permit. But hopefully, we're gonna have a lot of people coming in to do the ADUs, and I just didn't want to bog down the board's agenda with that. That's purely a call from the board and the county manager and how we proceed with that. So that's for the accessory dwelling units. There was public comment at one of the planning board meetings from Mr. Garrity. He's here today. And he asked during the planning board review process that we expand the allowable ADUs to be allowed in districts that are pure single-family dwelling, or pure residential districts, such as the A1, the R1 and the R4, those districts that are your traditional year-round communities where there aren't supposed to be duplexes and there aren't multifamily. And the planning board felt that that it wasn't appropriate at this time to include that as part of the recommendation, that we needed to see how these amendments functioned before we went that other step. Typically in those areas, they're covenants and homeowners associations, and that those restrictions, even if the zoning allowed it, those restrictions would still be in play. Even if you don't have an active homeowners association, if there's covenants there, they can be enforced by an individual homeowner. And we just felt that that was a step too far at this time. It may be that the board feels that that is appropriate to do, and if so, then I think that we can go back and review that, or we can acknowledge that we need to review it after 6 months' time, but that was not part of the planning board recommendation. I think that if you buy a house in one of those districts that is zoned the strict single-family district, that there's an expectation that that community and that neighborhood is going to continue to function that way, and that weighed very heavily on the planning board recommendation that we keep it out of the single-family districts at this point. So the ADU recommendation is just that it go in those districts that currently allow duplex structures.
One
Done.
thing I would add to that thought, going incrementally helps, because if you, wherever you allow it, if you find out later that it's a problem,
It's hard to.
backing up, you've created a whole litany of non-conforming uses that
Right.
are gonna continue to be problems for you decades into the future. So going incrementally may prevent some of those long-term problems if you find that some of this doesn't work as well as you thought.
Generally speaking, R1's already high density.
Yeah.
No, R1 is high density. R1 is just single-family homes. It's not.
Okay, I was
High
thinking
density.
of like the Hatteras colonies down in Salvo and Avon.
They're maybe not high density, but they were recorded before the 1982 minimum lot size. So they were
Right.
small lots, and
That-
so
that
there's
was
lots of
my-
houses in an area. Yeah.
That was my next question, is what, in unincorporated there, what is a typical R1 lot size, single family? Is it like your typical KDHs? Then Avalon area that's a 5,000 square foot lot, 50 by 100? Is that typical for unincorporated Dare?
Depending on the area of unincorporated Dare County. On Hatteras Island, where there are lots of subdivisions that were platted before 1982, the lot size is smaller than
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Here
So-
on Roanoke Island, the lots are generally bigger because Central Water was not here on Roanoke Island until the last 5 or 8 years ago. The R4 district, which is a single-family district, which is Kylington Harbor, those lots are
Right.
all 95% of the lots in Kylington Harbor are probably 7,500 square
Gotcha.
feet. Martins Point, which is an MP1, which is clearly, single family up there, they have really big lots though.
Right.
So as a rule of thumb, there's some lots out there that are single family in nature that are smaller in size. And even if we did have that in those zoning districts to allow that, the lot size probably would not allow you to have an accessory dwelling unit just because of the septic regulations.
Gotcha.
Exactly.
The fourth element of the planning board recommendation, and this was not part of the chamber recommendation, it was something that come about as the public hearing that the planning board conducted back in July, is amendments that deal with section 2231 of the zoning ordinance. And this is the section of the zoning ordinance that deals with group housing. Currently, section 2231, if you have a 20,000 square foot parcel, you can come in and put a second building on that. If you have a large one, we have residential group housing that where you have common ownership and you just own the footprint of the structure. And the way that 2231 is written now, you have to have 25-foot setbacks from all of the property line and 20 foot of separation from the buildings. The cluster home revisions would apply to those districts that currently can have a group housing development. There's 25 of those districts that are listed in section 2231, but we're going to have a cap on the size of the house that you can have on there, 1,200 square feet. It's consistent with the ADU size limit of 1,200 square feet. We're going to allow you to have these smaller homes on the piece of property. We're going to let you have a reduced setback so you don't have that 25-foot setback from all the property lines. It's a conditional use permit, and you're going to agree to all of this as part of your conditional use permit, and we're going to record that conditional use permit in the Register of Deeds. Instead of having a separation of 20 feet, we would allow you to have a separation of 15 feet. It would allow you to have a 30-foot right-of-way of 20 feet of paving versus a 45-foot right-of-way with 20 feet of paving. And there's 11 conditions that are written in there as part of the cluster home amendments. And those districts that would apply to would be R2, R2A, R2B, R2H, R2AH, R3, RS6, RS8, SP2, SPC, VC2, C2, C2H, C3, I1, S1, and then CS, BT, which is in Wanchese, RB, which is in Wanchese, MLH, WVC, MC1, MC2, and Highway 345. Those last districts are all there in Wanchese. So you've got 8 districts in Wanchese and 17 throughout the rest of the county.
Thank you, Donna.
Was Mans Harbor included in those?
I'm sorry?
Was Mans Harbor included in those?
Mans Harbor does not allow group developments.
Okay.
So I did not include those in them. And that was one of those things in the increments that was part of what the planning board talked about is we're only proposing or recommending that the cluster homes be allowed and added to those districts where you can currently have group housing developments. We are not asking to add this to any districts that don't already allow group housing. So it kind of narrows the scope, and it may be that we want to come back and look at that as a later development because in concept, you could go into these districts that are your R1s or your R4s because you still have single-family homes. It's just single-family homes on a bigger piece of property, but the R1s and the R4s and the NP1s aren't currently in section 2231, so we didn't broaden the scope of it in this recommendation, and that might be something that we want to go back and evaluate in the coming months.
I had a quick question, actually two-part question. Is the term group housing the same as cluster family housing? I feel like you've used them interchangeably, and I was trying to make sure I understood that.
Yes, you can be a group housing and not be a cluster family development, so you can be a group housing and not agree to be year-round residential, and you can have no caps on the size of your houses, but you have a bigger setback and a bigger separation. If you want to come in and take advantage of these reduced setbacks and reduced separations, you agree to a 1,200 square foot. So yes, they are kind of interchangeably, but
But
they're
not
not. They're not
exactly.
mutually exclusive, though.
Okay, then second question, could you give me an example of this? I tried to follow the explanation, and I'm trying to picture an example of what we're talking about here.
I don't think we have done a group housing development conditional use permit since you've been on the board. Kennekeet Shores down in Avon has some group housing. The Bell Acres that we just approved there in Kylington, you may have been on the board when we did the Bell Acres. It was right there at Kylington. You've got one big, let's say you have a 3-acre tract and you have a footprint area, and that's what is sold. You buy the footprint, you get a 20 by 50 footprint or however big that is, and that's where you build your house. And then the other part of the property is held in common ownership, and it's managed by a homeowners association. So you don't have a 15,000 square foot lot that you own in fee simple, you just own your footprint, and everything else is managed by the homeowners association.
So these would be a number of smaller dwellings where you would own the footprint, and then the rest of the property is a
Right.
common ownership.
Similar to a studio apartment set up in an urban area where you have the common areas all owned by the developer, but you have these individual
Yeah,
houses.
thank you. I was trying to picture how or where this would apply, and I wasn't familiar with it, so that's helpful. Thanks,
Yes,
Donna.
sir. There are some associated definitions that are part of the package from the planning board. A definition for accessory dwelling unit, cluster home development, duplex, long-term occupancy, principal dwelling unit, and short-term vacation occupancy, and I've talked about those. The requested action today is that we send this packet of amendments either as they are, or if we want to make revisions today, that we send them to public hearing. The first opportunity that we can have for public hearing is October the 15th. And if we take that motion today, take that action today, I can schedule that and we can have the public hearing on the 15th, or if the board wants to schedule it for later in the year, we can certainly do that as well. That is the first available date.
Sure, go ahead, Steve.
Donna, earlier we were talking about you doing CUPs, and that would bog our agenda down. So would you propose that those would actually go through the planning board itself?
No, they
Or
would just be
they-
subject to the planning department review.
Okay.
Just like we do single-family houses
She
now.
would take the checklist and say, if you meet all these requirements, then
Then you're
we
good.
issue the permit. If you don't, then you don't get the permit.
And we would have you sign that statement and then hopefully have it recorded in the register of
Donna,
deeds.
if you would, how about discuss the impacts? You had a chart.
Oh,
and
yes,
that-
sir. And I want to preface this by saying that I included that in this chart in there, and it's by no means set in stone, because this doesn't factor into how your wastewater is. But I did go through and take all of the tax records and I applied filters to them. I went through and the districts where you can have the R2, where you can have duplexes, I went through and I filtered out all of the vacant properties that are 15,000 square feet or more that did not have covenants applied to them. I'm sorry, I didn't apply that to the duplexes. No, I did, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes right here. Vacant privately owned land, no subdivision, I took out the marsh acreages, and then in the ones that had no access that were landlocked. And you can see there, I've broken it down according to my calculations, which is not scientific by any means, 389 parcels that may qualify for duplex structure construction. Those are scattered out: Avon, Buxton, Frisco, Hatteras, Rodanthe, Wave, Salvo, Kylington, Mans Harbor, Eastlake, Manteo out, and then Wanchese. And then I also went through and did a similar analysis for existing residential lots where there was a single-family home that, according to the tax records, is the land use, no subdivision, so that the covenants were taken out of it, the marsh acreage and the access in them. In the individual districts, I went through and tried to filter out the streets where I knew there was R1 zoning, or there was, zoning that was going to play into it. And then you'll see I've listed all the filters that I've applied. And just based on that, again, 15,000 square foot, it might be that you have a smaller lot that you could squeeze in an ADU, but for this purpose, I just used 15,000 square feet, 905 parcels. So, and again, that doesn't account for wastewater. I couldn't figure out how to account for wastewater because that can get fairly complicated, and there's so many different systems that you can use now. So
this would mean in the current set of rules that are being proposed, that this would be the number of lots of eligible for duplexes and the lots eligible for the ADUs.
Yep.
Yes,
Right.
Potential.
So
Yes, sir.
let's presume for a moment that 50% of them would be developed in this way.
right?
The question I'm getting to is the view worth to climb, is what I'm getting at. And the question is, and in your mind, does that make a significant difference in terms of what we're trying to accomplish here?
I think so. I think anything that we do is a step in the right direction. And as we've talked about during this whole discussion, is that we may want to reevaluate. And if we're successful with this, see if we can expand to some of those other zoning districts, or go in and try to identify some of those areas that have the single-family zoning on them now, but may not have covenants on it. I think that there's probably some land out there that may qualify for that, but that was a much more in-depth analysis, and I wanted to get this back to the board so that we could act on it and get something on the books.
Got it.
But I do think it's a
Looks
step in
like
the
it
right
makes
direction.
sense.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to first commend the planning department, planning board on what they've done. I would like to move to schedule a public hearing for October 15th.
Okay.
I'll second it.
There's a motion on the floor by Commissioner House, and it's been seconded by Commissioner Tobin to schedule a public hearing for 5:30 PM on October the 15th. Any further discussion? Danny?
Yes, sir. Donna, on SCD1, but you filtered out the special environmental district. What is the criteria on why that was excluded? Is it existing, the existing rules in there for development? I know it's sensitive area.
Yes, for that very reason.
Okay, all right. I can explain that too, because I'll get a call or two.
That's our most restrictive zoning district, and that's not, and that's because of the aquifer there and the maritime woods. And in the past, when we've tried to go in and tinker with the SED one, it becomes controversial.
People get upset.
Yeah, and so I just didn't want to do that. I was trying to keep this clean and not bring in conflicts with covenants or with the more restrictive zoning districts that we have, and take that first step.
No, thank you. That's
ease
defeating
into
the
it.
purpose, kind of defeating the purpose of the SED1 here if we get
Yes.
expansive. All right. I'm just going to ask you, do you see this as stressing your staff? There's some complicated on the overall, between the rules where it's just, you have enough manpower? That's probably a stupid question.
I'll tell you that I'm stressed every day, but no, I'm just joking.
All right. I was just trying to get an idea of whether.
You know, clearly that's going to be
Would
the
that
challenge.
change your mind?
Yeah, but
No, they're very capable. I'm impressed with all of this. I just, I'm trying to wrap my head around, all of a sudden, our guys are scrambling, and they're gonna be scrambling more.
Commissioner Couch, more direct to you quick. As we go at each budget time, we will evaluate our manpower needs. If the demand becomes so great that it becomes a problem, then we'll
Yeah.
react to that and make sure we staff accordingly. We may not get as
Right.
much demand as we think, and if we don't, then it won't
That's
change
exact-
anything.
That's exactly right. So I think it's one of those things we just got to look and see. I mean, we're up to the task, though.
All right, good enough. Thank you.
I did have a question also.
Yeah, Commissioner Ross?
Donna, as usual, thank you. Outstanding work, meticulous detail, excellent job.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm trying to process the matrix, which again was in response to my earlier
Yes,
question.
sir.
Which is, again, I appreciate that, thank you. Roughly 1,300 parcels in unincorporated Dare County. If I look at the vacant lots eligible and then lots with existing residential that would be potential eligible, that struck me as a big number. Sort of like, wow, that doesn't even count the incorporated towns. And then I thought, I wonder if Donna has any idea, and not that you would, but this is just an open question, of what the incorporated towns might have that would be comparable to the 1,300 parcels in unincorporated.
I don't know. I just,
If you factored out the residential areas with covenants and those kind of things, then you've greatly diminished the towns because they don't have raw land. They don't have any S1s that are wide open for zoning.
Sure,
Their
that makes
limitations
sense.
are much greater than ours. So I don't think you would have nearly
near this, no.
this
Well,
kind of number in the towns.
That leads to my next point, because this has been such a matter of high concern and focus. I was sort of asking, have the planning directors from each incorporated town applied the same level of analysis and diligence that you and your team have done in preparing this review? Because this is a big deal. So, Manteo, Nag's Head, Kitty Hawk, Buildable Hills.
I think in the municipalities, their subdivisions have covenants, and that's typically the difference that you see between a municipality and a county government.
Sure.
They're just, for whatever reason, that's the way that they are. I have no way of knowing what level of involvement their staff has taken with, as far as the analysis with this. I think, quite honestly, they're waiting to see what the county's gonna do with their zoning ordinance before they take.
I'm looking back at a commissioner in the audience and wondering if they have applied the same level of diligence.
Well, Commissioner Ross, Kitty Hawks have been out front with this. They've already done this.
Yep.
Now, I don't know about the number of parcels, and maybe Irvin could address that, but they've been proactive and already have
Yeah.
passed initiatives to make these things happen.
So my point driving behind all of this is, again, it is such a topic of concern and priority in all of these meetings, in the candidate forums, the Outer Banks Realtor Association candidate forum. If the 1,300 parcels we've identified are supplemented with 6 in Kitty Hawk, 600 in Kitty Hawk, I'm trying to, again, get a feel for the scale of magnitude here, because this, again, is a terrific piece of analysis and helps us all to grasp what we have in the unincorporated areas. Given what you explained, Bobby, which I understand and appreciate, the covenants, the restrictive zoning, is it fair to say we really don't have much in the incorporated towns, and that if we're going to focus on the problem, this is where we've got to put our attention, on these 1,300 parcels?
I think it's fair to say that, because there's just not the vacant land that we have.
That's what I
in
was trying to
unincorporated
seek
Dare
out,
County.
Donna, so
But
yeah.
in the discussions that we have had with the towns, and I think Councilman Connors is here, Southern Shores went through that with regard to mother-in-law suites and ADAs.
Yeah, sorry, Jim, yeah,
whatever you
of
call
course.
it, right, that they did in some of the towns. And so the opportunities in the towns come there. And how that impacts covenants, how that impacts zoning, I don't know how the answer to that. But that's where, if they're gonna do anything, what they're looking at. They're not gonna have raw land that you can come in, or not much, that you can come in and take 389 vacant duplex parcels. I wouldn't
Well,
think.
it's the ADUs where I was thinking.
Yeah, that are
Yeah, that's the most fertile.
That's where I had my thoughts, so. Okay, well, sorry to take up the time. I was just trying to get more context than I, again, know that you're very familiar and knowledgeable.
They just function differently in their zoning than our
Right.
zoning. They're more single-family oriented.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Well, without further discussion, then those in favor of the motion on the floor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries unanimous. Thank you, Donna.
Very
Great
good.
job.